I'm coming from the Deputy Prime Minister's Office for European Integration and being a member of the Poverty Reduction and Social Inclusion Unit. I'm going to tell you about the first sustainable mechanisms of cooperation, and communication between the state and the civil society organizations, but I'm just going to tell you a brief introduction of the whole process of establishing this mechanism. This unit was created within the Deputy Prime Minister's Office in 2004 with the mandate to coordinate, oversee, and report on the implementation of poverty reduction strategy. Poverty reduction strategy was created in 2002 and 2003, and it was the first multi-sectoral midterm development strategy at that time that was drafted and created in the process of involvement of more than 4,000 people from all the relevant institutions and organizations, including civil society organizations. So basically, the process of implementation of the PRS started in 2004, ended in 2009. In the meanwhile, the two progress reports on the PRS implementation was produced, two governmental reports. Speaking of involvement of civil society organization, actually in the process of drafting such a huge document, I already mentioned more than 4,000 people took part in the process of creation of the document for the first time in Serbia in the transparent and sustainable way. Civil society organizations were included in the process of drafting and creating the first strategy. Actually, the whole process of involvement of the relevant and different actors who took part in the drafting this document was in a way of involving organization institutions through committees or councils that took part in the process of giving their inputs for the final document. In that way, we had the committee or the council at that time of civil society organizations who were asked for their inputs for the PRS strategy. In the meanwhile, when the process of implementation has started and already went further, we, as the unit who was in charge of coordinating and monitoring the implementation of PRS, were completely acknowledged of the necessity of creation of new mechanism for the involvement of civil society organizations in the PRS implementation. In 2006, we started thinking of creating the new mechanism that should involve wider and deeper civil society organization in the PRS implementation, having in mind that the line ministry and all the relevant governmental institutions were in our focus. So basically, we were monitoring the implementations of PRS measures, basically and predominantly on the level of the government and relevant governmental institutions. We actually spent a lot of time thinking how to create the sustainable mechanism for involvement of PRS in the PRS of the civil society organization in the PRS implementation, since we didn't have any sustainable mechanism that we could rely on at that time. All the mechanisms, let's say, that were existing at that time were already signed MOU or some kind of the agreement between the relevant institutions. At that time, Serbian European Integration Office, and then later on Ministry of Human and Minority Rights already signed the MOUs with around 100 NGOs. Besides that, all the mechanisms that we could rely on were regularly open call for proposals from the different line ministries. What I forgot to mention, and what was also important, that what PRS brought among the other relevant points is that this strategy was for the first time based and drafted on the facts. So basically in 2002 and 2003, it was a living standard measurement survey was conducted at that time, which was used as a baseline for the strategic document. And this survey brought us for the first time the statistics of the poorest of the general population and defined for the first time the vulnerable groups in the society as such. So actually, ever since 2003, according to the PRS strategy, the government adopted and worked on the strategic and legal framework of all the relevant vulnerable groups first defined in the PRS strategy. So basically, these 7 vulnerable groups that defined based on LSMS or Living Standard Measurement Survey was Roma, people with disabilities, children till 14, young population. Tanya already mentioned the definition of young people, refugees and IDPs, elderly 65 plus, and women. It was a very good starting point, as I said, that ever since 2004, that was strategy, that was the beginning of the PRS implementation. Government, let's say, finished its job in terms of creating legal and strategic framework for all these relevant vulnerable groups, and even started the implementation of some of these plans. So actually, when we're thinking of how to define the sustainable mechanism for involvement of civil society organization in the process of PRS implementation, we definitely rely on these 7 vulnerable groups. And it was the starting point for other thinking of the future mechanism. So basically, through call for proposal for the civil society organizations, we managed to create the mechanism that we finally call civil society focal points for the PRS implementation. That included 7 civil society focal points or contact organizations for these 7 vulnerable groups who actually were in charge to create twofold communication and a cooperation mechanism with the government and relevant line ministries. These 7 vulnerable groups were actually representatives of the clusters or the groups of the NGOs who were relevant in working with these vulnerable groups. So basically, when we speak about, for example, civil society focal point for Roma, it was the organization from Kragujevac, but as a representatives of 200 NGOs dealing with Roma issues, basically local NGOs and community-based organizations dealing with the vulnerable groups. So the idea was actually very, very great from the beginning, and it was the good basis for the further work. That the mechanism actually involved the final beneficiaries, meaning vulnerable groups, through their representatives on the local level or the local NGOs and community-based organizations gathered in the clusters, defining and articulating their interests through civil society focal point or the contact organizations, finally towards governmental institutions on the relevant line ministries and the way back. This mechanism, as we call it, civil society focal points mechanism, involved more than 650 NGOs. That at this point is Tanya, you tell if you can say if I'm wrong, is bigger than the federation of the associations of the civil society that we have in Serbia. So basically, predominantly, these NGOs were focused on the issues of poverty reduction and social inclusion of the all listed vulnerable groups, and took part in all the relevant drafting and creating strategic and legislative framework ever since 2007 till now, relevant for the issues of vulnerable groups in the sector of social protection, health, education, employment, SMEs, rural development, housing, social and economic and human and minority rights. From our perspective, basically, what we did in the parallel process is to create the relevant, let's say, network of civil society, of administrative focal points in all the relevant line ministries. So basically,